After 4 long years of war, a vast area of France was left devastated by the conflict. This was the Zone Rouge. It seemed to be part of a past, but re-emerged in the press reports of the Great War Centenary. So what are the myths of the Red Zone, and what are its truths? When the Great War on the Western Front ended in November of 1918, huge swathes of France were left devastated after 4 long years of war. The French examined how affected their countryside had been from a material point of view, how much that destruction had destroyed the landscape where the fighting had taken place. And they viewed that in what was called le bilan de la guerre, kind of the bill of the war. And the bilan de la guerre was a huge poster with all kinds of statistics on it, a lot of it to do with the dead, but it also contained some information on the material losses of the Great War within France on that landscape. So this document stated that almost 1,700 communes across France had been completely destroyed in the Great War. What does this mean, completely destroyed? Now, when we read the memoirs of soldiers who fought in that conflict, they often describe the level of destruction that they see. Ernst Junger, in Storm of Steel, talks about coming onto the landscape of the Somme, and they realise that they're coming into an area where there'd once been a village, by the stain of the ground, the bricks and the stone of buildings that have been pulverised by artillery bombardments have stained the soil, and that stain indicates, together probably with the biggest pile of rubble that once was the church, that they're now in a place that had once been home to families, to people, to farmers, to ordinary folk. So this level of destruction for 1,700 communes completely destroyed, it really means they were quite literally blown off the map. And that's right across France, but on some of the key battlefields, the Somme, Verdun in the Champagne, the village of Courcelette, where I used to live, would be one of those, completely destroyed by the end of the First World War. Not a single building left standing, not a single building that was habitable, and the population came back and had to live in the cellars of the old houses. That was all that was usable, together with provisional housing, military buildings like Nissen huts. That was what ordinary folk of France had to experience when they returned to these communes after the war. And villages and even towns that were destroyed like this, but these are mainly villages, were awarded the Croix de Guerre by France as a symbol of that destruction. You can often see it displayed on the mairie, the town hall of that village. I was in Montfaucon recently, exploring the Meuse-Argonne battlefields, and we went into the village square. There's a memorial to one of the American divisions on one of the buildings there, Sherman tank from World War II, and we pulled up outside the mairie, and there above the main entrance is the visible symbol of the Croix de Guerre. So it's often used in these villages to indicate that you are in a village that once was destroyed. And it was awarded a physical medal as well. And very often these are on display in the town hall in the mairie. They're kept often by the mayor as well. In Courcelette, he used to keep it and bring it out for special occasions. So that's what we're talking about. Nearly 1,700 communes destroyed, completely destroyed in the Great War. In addition, another 1,800 had been partially destroyed. So we're looking at over 3,000 communes across France, either partially destroyed or completely destroyed by 4 years of bombardments and the fighting that had raged. This amounted, according to Le Bilan de la Guerre, to almost 320,000 houses completely destroyed and a further 313,000 damaged by the conflict. That's over 500,000 houses. In larger towns and cities across France, over 20,000 factories had been destroyed. And when we start to look at the infrastructure of France, we discover that over 8,000 kilometres of railway line had been smashed to pieces by bombardments or had been deliberately destroyed. The Germans did a lot of that in the withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line and towards the end of the Great War, but 8,000 kilometres of railway line. And in terms of the other infrastructure on that landscape of the Great War, where the battles had been fought, over 4,800 bridges had been blown, and over 52,000 kilometres of roads were now unusable, like the villages, like the whole landscape, pulverised so that the roads were no longer usable. When you look at some of the imagery from that post-war period, the only way to get around on some of those battlefields is not with the roads that were there before the war, but in the remains of the plank roads, the wooden roads constructed by engineers during the war itself and still there. And in terms of the actual physical landscape around these houses and infrastructure, over 2 million hectares of cultivated ground had been completely destroyed, and in addition, 1.7 million hectares of farmland. So this scale of the devastation was simply immense after the Great War, beyond the experience of any generation within Europe for some centuries. So what to do with this pulverised, this destroyed landscape? Some thought about leaving it as a brown, livid scar, as one veteran described it, or foresting it. And in some cases, like Verdun, that's exactly what happened. Verdun, that symbol of France's Great War, it was decided to preserve the battlefield by turning it into a national forest and planting trees to preserve the trenches and the ravines and the shell holes and all the other positions on that landscape. Churchill, when he came to Ypres in 1919, is said to have remarked that that ground should be forested to preserve it, and other battlefields were considered to be kind of preserved in that way. But that wasn't always practical, because people began to return as soon as the fighting was over and wanted to reclaim their lives and their land and their livelihoods. So while the French government pushed through the preservation of the Verdun landscape, that wasn't possible everywhere, the realities of life returning to some degree of normality. But in those thousands of communes destroyed in the war, people, they did want to come home and rebuild their lives and physically rebuild their homes and their farms and their businesses. But how to do this? If you return to a village that has literally been blown off the map, where do you even begin? Well, one issue was, of course, the funding of this. Who pays for these places to be rebuilt? Many of these people had not only lost their property and their jobs and everything else, they'd lost their money during the war. So who would finance this rebuilding? I think initially there wasn't much evidence of really clearly who would step forward with the funds to do this. There was murmurings within France itself. There was talk of punishing Germany and making them pay for this level of destruction that had taken place. But to really get to grips with this, because it was realised that you just couldn't just leave it, one way was to classify that region that had been destroyed so that funds and help, assistance and everything else that was required could be allocated to repair, restore and rebuild. So that part of the battlefields affected amongst those statistics of Le Bilan de la Guerre became the Zone Rouge, the red zone. And that's when this concept of the red zone was born, in the immediate aftermath of the Great War. And news of this red zone quickly spread to British newspapers, as even in those first few months of 1919, people began to visit the battlefields of the Great War, and talk of this was spreading amongst those visitors. And one of the first mentions of the red zone in the British press that I can find was just a year after the end of the Great War, in November 1919, but in an Indian published newspaper. The correspondent wrote, "The red zone is the term that has been given to that desolate and truly awful bind of country, in many places 15 to 20 miles wide, stretching from the Vosges to the North Sea and marking the stabilised line of the front as it existed for some 4 years. I traversed one of the sections of it lately between Albert and Arras, and knowing what its former prosperity was agricultural and industrial, I expected to see many signs of returning activity and labour. I saw nothing but a desert, with the exception of Arras, where, notwithstanding the ravages done by shell fire and bombs, the wonderful Renaissance cathedral, showing nothing of its former beauty, save a few sculpted details of the outer walls. Albert remains quite deserted and is like a city of the dead, every house left standing being open to the weather. Villages have not only been levelled to the ground, but in some cases have quite disappeared. Their place knows them no more. There is hardly a trace of returning cultivation on the far-stretched desert of grass-grown hummocks thrown up by shells and separated by deep holes, which in many cases are pools. There is hardly a living tree, but there are phantom trees in abundance, woods of them, all stark and nearly branchless. The solitude is appalling. The red zone seems to have been abandoned by men as if it were accursed." Now that correspondence wondering if it would be left abandoned as an area for cattle to roam, that was what he thought. Would it just be left so that cattle would graze it like some vast prairie? But already, in that 12 months since the end of the war, the desire of people to live their lives again pushed forward the Reconstruction phase. And that is really, that Reconstruction, the subject of probably a separate podcast and something we will return to. But aided by French money, later perhaps by some German war reparations that were extracted from Germany under the Treaty of Versailles, and support also from Britain and its empire, gradually places were rebuilt, particularly in that period from 1922 to 1924. So Britain and the Empire, what was their kind of role in this? Well, what happened is that a lot of places in Britain, seeing the destruction, hearing about the destruction of these villages in parts of the battlefields where local men had fought and fell and local regiments had taken part in battles there, they were very keen to kind of adopt places to help them be rebuilt. In the village of Montauban on the Somme, there's a water tower paid for by the town of Maidstone in Kent. The 7th Royal West Kents had fought there during the Battle of the Somme, very close by. And they wanted to have a practical memorial, not just build a statue, but to build something that would mean something to the people of the village of Montauban. So town after town, village after village even, helped in the reconstruction of places that they essentially twinned with. And we see some evidence of this today. 1 or 2 places are still twinned with these locations on the battlefields. Others, the twinning has kind of faded away. In Albert, near the Basilica, the main church in Albert, there is the Rue de Birmingham. That is a shadow of the twinning between Birmingham and Albert in the 1920s and how they helped Albert rebuild itself during that period. And the 1922 to 24, looking at that was the key period in which the brick houses of the Somme and northern France and the more stone-structured buildings of eastern France, that's when they went up. And I know this from my own personal experience. When we were renovating the house at Courcelette all those years ago, up in the roof were the roof timbers, and quite a few of those had the delivery dates of when those roof timbers had been delivered and added to the structure that was being put up, a replacement farmhouse in this case, so that the roof could be placed on top. Now, they're not going to sit around for a long time, and most of those were delivered in the summer of 1922 or the summer of 1923. So we kind of see from buildings on that landscape today, and often some buildings, particularly civil buildings, have dates of reconstruction on them, and they're all about that kind of time. So that was a period which is 5 or 6 years after the end of the fighting. And in that interim period, people have been living in these very primitive kind of conditions in cellars and nissen huts and provisional housing. You see some of that provisional housing still left on the battlefields today. Again, on the Somme, you can see this in villages like Guillemont. There's a couple of examples there, wooden houses. Some of these really kind of need to be preserved before they all disappear. I mean, in my own kind of years of visiting the battlefields, many of these have gone. But that was how they lived. And then in that period of 22 to 24, they kind of moved out of the darkness of these cellars and huts and shanty towns back into real houses and properly began to rebuild their lives. So already the kind of nature of the Zone Rouge, the red zone, is beginning to change. Communes, those shattered communes, they are being rebuilt. So gradually what that red zone, that Zone Rouge stood for, total desolation, that faded, thankfully faded. Some areas of these former battlefields had not been forested, but they'd been swallowed up as military camps. There's quite a few of those in eastern France. Montmelon, Sweep, near Soins in the Champagne, all these kind of places. And the French army set up camps there in ground that had been devastated by the war. There was quite a number of abandoned villages there that couldn't be rebuilt because they'd been so shattered by the bombardments. And those sites are still very present to this day and are still military camps. And in some cases, many villages that were outside these camps, outside forests, we know of the village détruit or village disparu, the destroyed or disappeared villages at Verdun like Fleury or Besançon or Douaumont, but there are many, many others right across France. Those were not rebuilt, they were kind of sacrificed at Verdun, as we've said, to create a larger memorial in terms of the landscape itself. But in other places, villages literally could not be rebuilt. Mouquet Farm on the Somme is in a different place today because the original foundations were too weak after all those bombardments for the farm to be built in the same place. And if you extrapolate that and think of a whole village, that's kind of what happened in so many different places. But generally, across the battlefields of the Great War on what had once been the Western Front, within a decade of the armistice, the landscape had begun to recover. The Hull Daily Mail, for example, reported in 1924, a report from the prefect on the Somme to the Council General shows that practically all the fields in the red zone, which were under cultivation before the war, are now again bearing crops. Only 1,000 hectares of arable land will be brought by the government as useless to their present owners. These desert tracts are situated in communes like Fries, Beaumont-Hamel, Beaucourt-sur-Ancre and Chiapval. So that's one kind of snapshot of one part of the Western Front that's familiar to most of us listening to this podcast, the areas of the Somme. And if I kind of jump on to the early 1980s when I first went to the battlefields, and that landscape really hadn't changed much since that interwar period. In those days there were more areas of unused land that was clear where you could see the undulations of trenches and shell holes or gun positions or dugout entrances. Gradually, in those 40-odd years, quite a lot of those have now been ploughed up, have finally been cultivated. There are still a few, but not as many as there were. But we can see even within 6 years of the end of the war, during that kind of key rebuilding period, the houses are being rebuilt, the farms are being rebuilt, the factories and the mills are being rebuilt, and the landscape is being recovered, cleared of the ordnance that had saturated it, barbed wire. I mean, you think of the thousands of kilometres worth of barbed wire that there must have been pushed into shell holes and buried, and gradually the farmers reclaim their land. Not without cost in some cases, because there are many reports of casualties of farmers hitting large caliber shells, and explosions cause casualties as a consequence of that. But gradually that landscape is becoming not a landscape of war, but now a landscape of peace, where farming and prosperity can return. And then by 1928, the year of the Great Pilgrimage of the British Legion across the battlefields of the Western Front, the Leeds Mercury, for example, reported that there were only 30,000 hectares of the more than 2 million that had once been classified as devastated that were uncultivated. So out of the 2 million hectares of ground that in documents like the Bilan de la Guerre have been classified as completely devastated by the war, 30,000 by 1928, a decade after the war was over, only 30,000 was still unusable. Now, that's 30,000 too many, I guess, in the minds of French farmers and French people, but it shows the level of reclamation of land that had taken place. A huge percentage, that's 90-odd%, I'm no mathematician, that's 90-odd% of the ground has been recovered and reclaimed as being used. And what you see is you then begin to look at the newspapers into the 1930s, and these are good kind of indicators, really, newspapers, as to what's going on in the battlefields in that period. There's a lot of coverage of it because people are interested, and there are spikes and there are dips in this. In the war book period of the late 1920s, there's a lot of reports. There's a bit of a dip in the early 30s, and then with big pilgrimages like Vimy in 36, Thiepval in 32, and even in the kind of closeness to the next war, there's a lot of mentions of it. But what you find in the 1930s in newspapers is very, very few, if any, mentions of the Zone Rouge, of the Red Zone. It's kind of faded into memory. It fades away, and it seems to have become part of the past. It's something that had happened rather than was still happening. And mention of it didn't really return until the Great War Centenary of 2014 to 2018. So all those decades went by, and when I first went across to the battlefields in the 80s, I don't recall too many people talking about this. There wasn't an awareness of the Red Zone perhaps then. As I delved deeper into it, of course, I came across reference to it, particularly in some of the kind of contemporary publications, studying in some of the archives in France. But it faded away, and then it comes back a century after the war. So what brought that interest in the Red Zone back? What prompted that interest in that destroyed and devastated region of France? And why did it take until the centenary for people to get interested in it again? And that's what we'll look at in the next part of the podcast. During the Great War Centenary, which incredibly began a decade ago in 2014, I sometimes wonder where that decade has gone. The subject of the First World War during that period was very much part of public consciousness, and that was a really good thing. This was kind of when the general public reawakened to the subject of the Great War, when many people travelled to the battlefields of the Great War. There were literally millions of visitors to those battlefields of the old front line during that period, and the press was full of stories. There were local projects. It was a fantastic period for anyone fascinated in the subject of the First World War. And the press across the world, because of the popular interest in this, looked for stories, as the presses want to do. And they looked for factual stories, stories of people. There was a lot of coverage of groups within the kind of wider experience of the First World War, black soldiers, the importance of the role of women, how women were affected by the war with the casualties. All these kinds of stories kind of came out of the past and were retold in many of these newspaper and magazine articles. And again, that was really brilliant, fantastic to see. And many of these stories were fascinating and engaging, but there were some that were perhaps less accurate, for me, less engaging, and in some cases perhaps even alarming. And one that persisted on and off during that period was the idea of no-go zones left devastated by war from a century before across both France and Belgium. And the idea that this red zone, which probably very few people before 2014 had even heard of, this idea that it still existed, that there were still parts of France devastated, that you couldn't go into, they were so poisoned, so gassed, so destroyed, that even a century later it wasn't possible to go in there, and you risked your life if you did. So let's look at a couple of examples of this. The National Geographic, which needs no introduction here, is a well-respected journal and a good example of the kind of print media stories that ran at this time. So it ran an article entitled "France's Zone Rouge is a lingering reminder of World War I's Battle of Verdun." In this article it stated, "The intense fighting and shelling near the tiny town of Verdun has permanently altered the regions surrounding the Meuse River in northeastern France. The environmental destruction left by the battle led to the creation of the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone. The Zone Rouge is a 42,000-acre territory that nearly a century later after the conflict has no human residence and only allows limited access." Joseph Upi, a geography professor at the University of Wisconsin, who specializes in military geography, said all of these villages were destroyed by those explosive munitions and the area was abandoned. When the war ended in 1918, the French government considered the time and cost of rehabilitating the land. Rather than attempting to remove all the shells and munitions in the area, the government ultimately decided on a minor forced relocation. The government moved people out of the area and created the Zone Rouge. Those villages were considered a casualty of the war. So that's kind of an interesting statement based on the facts that we've already looked at. Some of the figures don't add up there. You've got the idea that the Red Zone was created by the French to push people out because these were areas where they decided they couldn't be bothered or couldn't possibly, given the volume, remove the munitions that were there. That's not really how the Red Zone came into being. And in most cases, even within the Red Zone, the actual Red Zone, munitions were removed, munitions were blown up, munitions were buried in some cases, along with a huge array of other war material as well. So what you've got there is the beginning of the kind of creation of a myth, the idea that these devastated zones, unfit for human habitation, dangerous even 100 years later, where nothing grows, no birds sing, no trees grow, nothing, that they still exist in huge acreage across northern France. And one interesting element of the article was a quote from historian Christina Holstein, who again we've mentioned many times on the podcast when we discuss Verdun. Her work is kind of central to our understanding of the Battle of Verdun today, and her books on the subject are highly, highly recommended. And Christina Holstein was quoted in this way by that article. Holstein also thinks that the Zone Rouge's light human footprint over the last 100 years might actually be one of its greatest assets. Because it has been abandoned and covered with trees, it is a microcosm of something that happened 100 years ago, Holstein says. It's a bit like a sleeping beauty. These things have just got frozen in time. And that's, I think, kind of one of the truths that emerges from articles like this. Christina has highlighted a point there that the preservation of these parts of what had been the Red Zone, the Zone Rouge, had frozen time, that beneath the canopy of trees at Verdun or within some of these military encampments, the battlefield had been left. The trenches remained, the shell holes, the positions, the observation posts, the mine craters, everything, and the ruins of some of these disappeared villages. And you kind of see not so much that aspect of it, which I think is possibly a bit left field for these sensationalist articles. They're more interested in creating the idea of zones where, and they illustrated them very extensively with photographs of panels on fences with skulls and crossbones and danger de mort, danger of death, do not enter. That kind of signage went up everywhere. What they didn't explain, of course, is that signage went up because most of those signs are up around the edge of these military encampments. And also at Verdun, in the middle of the Verdun battlefield, near Fort Douaumont, the ruins of Douaumont village, was a live firing zone. And that was still used during that period. I think it's even still used to this day. And around the edge of it, there are these signs saying, do not enter, danger of death, because obviously if you walk into the middle of a live firing range when live firing is going on, then your chances of getting killed are pretty high. So those kind of signs were used as part of this myth building around the idea that a red zone still exists. And you can find, you don't have to go very far at all on the internet to find these kind of stories. And if you look at popular Facebook groups, it regularly comes up on there as well. So this myth really kind of got legs, and it ran and it ran and it ran, and it got traction, and it reached probably millions of people, because this is the kind of story that people love. They love to think that something like this could possibly exist. I say love, I mean that's probably the wrong phrase for it, but they're fascinated by it. And we're not decrying them in any kind of way, because it would be remarkable that this vast area of France was uninhabitable and not possible to enter a century after a conflict. But it's not true. And that doesn't stop articles being published again and again. So War History Online, for example, a massive, highly influential website that tells these kind of stories covering both world wars and indeed other conflicts, says Zone Rouge, or the Red Zone, is a chain of former battlefields across northeastern France that the government has cordoned off due to the many dangerous ordnance that remains from the First World War. Zone Rouge is ultimately one of 4 different ones on and around the former battlefields of the Western Front, ranging from the most to least dangerous. These areas serve as an eerie reminder of the past. And kind of what you see there is the kind of promotion of the idea that the ordnance remains a big problem. And of course it does. But the ordnance remains only a problem in these devastated red zones that supposedly still exist. But any visitor to the battlefield will know that the ordnance is a problem everywhere. If I stand in the forest at Verdun, and if a huge gale swept through there and knocked over thousands of trees in front of my very eyes and ripped up the roots, I would see a huge amount of ordnance from the First World War. But that battlefield, before it was forested, was cleared to a degree on a surface level, as were the battlefields at Arras and the Somme and Loos, and on other French sectors of the First World War, and in vast areas of open fields that are actively cultivated and have been actively cultivated since the 1920s. The same issue of ordnance, of live shells and grenades and mortar rounds and everything else, is just as prevalent, perhaps more prevalent, because that landscape is continually turned over and things come to the surface. At Verdun, as Christina Holstein had said, it freezes that landscape in time, and the shells and munitions are held beneath that landscape until there is, for example, reforestation, and that has happened at Verdun on and off over the decades that I've been visiting since the 1980s, and will no doubt continue. So the ordnance, the idea that the ordnance is the problem in that article and many others, is kind of a false idea really, because ordnance, the live shells, are a problem everywhere. I remember reading an article about Flanders, for example, where during the 50th anniversary they spoke about hopefully having found all the munitions in that area by the 1960s. Actually, they've found more and more every year since the 1960s. And some incredible statistics stated that they would expecting still to be finding shells from the First World War over the next 7 centuries. The volume of unexploded munitions was that great. And that's just Flanders. If we extrapolate that across the hundreds of miles of the old Western Front in France, we can see that there's a similar, if not even greater, problem there. But some of these articles really were quite sensationalist and quite incredulous kind of things that they proclaim. This one from a website called Alcation says, "Imagine a place so bespoiled its very entry is prohibited by national law. An area the size of Paris has been abandoned for nearly a century and will remain so for centuries to come. A place so geographically and ecologically annihilated, it's as desolate as the surface of Mars. One would think such a place exists only in fiction, yet in France it exists for real. It is the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, France's very own exclusion zone." I mean, these are kind of great headlines, but just not true. Nothing grows there. It's annihilated. It's like the surface of Mars. If that's true, how come the wildlife in the camps of the Champagne amongst the trees of Verdun, which are these areas that these articles claim are part of this red zone. How come nature has not just recovered there, it's flourished? How can that be true if it's as desolate as the surface of Mars? And a quick scan across Google Maps will show you that these areas are overgrown. There's a huge amount of vegetation. There are some areas where you can see exposed chalk in some of the camps in the Champagne, but that's because they are active training zones of the French military. Some of them are tank training grounds, tank firing grounds, and so tanks traverse them and the tracks chew up the vegetation. The areas where the tanks aren't operating are all overgrown. And you can see that not only clearly on Google Earth, on these kind of aerial shots of that part of France, but you can also see the remains of the First World War, clearly zigzag trenches and all kinds of things across that part of the landscape. But it's not just obscure websites that were making these kind of claims. A BBC article from 2018 picked up the story and looked at the lost villages of France. It stated that during World War I, French and German soldiers completely razed 9 villages during the Battle of Verdun, the longest and one of the fiercest artillery battles of the war. The shells contaminated the earth so badly with lead, arsenic and lethal poison gas, France determined that most of the villages could not be rebuilt. Casualties of war, it was said they had died for France. Over the last 100 years, only one of the destroyed villages has been reconstructed. Another 2 have been partially rebuilt, but the remaining 6, including Fleury de Vendôme, sit uninhabited within France's Zone Rouge or Red Zone. Although no one lives in any part of this red zone, and much of it is still considered too dangerous for visitors. So that was the BBC claim. And again, there are some facts in there. The fierce bombardments at Verdun, the destruction of the ground, the villages mentioned. But this idea that, and I quote, it is still considered too dangerous for visitors. Fleury is perhaps one of the most visited sites on the Verdun battlefield. The Memorial de Verdun, the museum, is right next to it, and you can actively walk right through the middle of the village. You could do that back in the 80s when I first went there on a grass path, and the sites of all the former houses are marked with the details of who once lived there. You can see the shell holes amongst the trees, and during the centenary they thinned out a lot of the trees to open it up. So far from this being a place where it was so dangerous that you were going to die instantly by walking into it, actually, these places are part of the tourist trail, the pilgrimage trail, the battlefield visitors trail on these battlefield sites. So this idea that they're no-go areas, again, is false. But amongst some of these stories, and some of them, as we've said, quite sensationalist in their tone, there were some that hinted at what are the continuing real problems of what had once been the red zone. So one of the stories covered a place called Spancourt in France, which is not far from Verdun, in an area that the locals had come to call Place à Gaz, gas place, the place of gas. And that had been fenced off back in 2008 in an area which was particularly affected by the placement of gas cylinders and unexploded gas-based munitions, shells, canisters. This site, it was believed to have over 200,000 unexploded chemical bombs. Now, some of that was subsequently recovered, and there are photographs of guys in chemical suits going in there and recovering this to be taken off for specialist destruction and treatment so that the ground can be returned. But the ground itself, I think, was probably so polluted that was probably not going to be possible for generations, if ever. And what that showed was that it wasn't just the areas where the fighting, Spancourt is just kind of outside the main area of fighting, that it wasn't just these battlefields where this was a problem, it was part of the logistics trail of these battlefields where there'd been depots of ammunition and supplies. And in recent years, I've read all kinds of stories in areas behind the front at Arras, behind the lines on the Somme, behind the lines in the Champagne, and all across the Western Front, where they have found munitions in areas where this has been stockpiled, waiting to be taken up to the front. So that was a real problem at Spancourt. It was a real problem of disposal of munitions that had been dumped there, and had laid there ever since and gradually deteriorated, polluting and killing, really, in many respects, killing that ground. And then at the far end of the Western Front, there was another report that spoke of Lake Gérardmer in Lorraine, a huge lake where munitions had been dumped at the end of both World Wars, not just the Great War, but the end of the Second World War, because there'd been heavy fighting in the Vosges in 1944-45. And recent surveys during that Great War Centenary period had shown toxicity levels had risen above modern norms. And even very recently, this story returned in December 2023, and the story had continued with a new study of the lake, which had shown that the munitions that were dumped at the bottom of the lake, which they thought they recovered quite a lot during a previous period, was on a scale not really previously realised. So again, this was an area where munitions had been dumped at Spancourt during the war, at the lake in Lorraine after the war, and they were kind of two good examples of this being a problem. And if you travel across the battlefields of the Great War, you will find the local authorities having ordnance dumps where munitions recovered from the battlefields, from farming, from building projects are brought to for disposal. There's one not far from Vimy Ridge in northern France, for example. The Somme area, they have one towards the coast. Sometimes they blow munitions up in the fields, particularly the larger shells now. But these kind of sites are prevalent. But outside of that, you have places that are found during construction, during road building, during the expansion of the communes, either on or around the area of the First World War battlefields. So again, as we often say on this podcast about the last page of the history of the Great War never turning, then that is certainly true in terms of the way the aftermath, the legacy of the war, with the outcome of what had created that Zone Rouge by the 1920s, that is still very much part of life on those battlefields 110 years later. So what's the truth of all this idea of a Zone Rouge, a myth of a Zone Rouge that grew during the Great War Centenary? It's clear that at the end of the Great War, there was a massive area of France that had been destroyed by the conflict. The grounds was polluted with gas, full of munitions, with toxic substances like lead and arsenic and other chemicals from explosives and munitions. At the time, it was thought that this landscape would possibly never recover. But even when we look at the photographs of locations on these battlefields during the war, we see, for example, Delville Wood literally blown to pieces during that period where it became Devil's Wood in the summer of 1916. A year later, there are photographs of South Africans revisiting the wood on the first anniversary of the battle to place memorials there, and already the undergrowth has begun to come up amongst the shattered trees, and the landscape looks like it's beginning to recover. So even during the war, there were instances of this. And when we read about some of the March 1918 battles, where the British Army was thrown back by the German Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser offensive, towards the old battlefields of 1916, they come across grassed-over trenches from those previous battles. So we see even in that time frame, the landscape had begun to recover. So in those years afterwards, then, after the war was over, some landscapes were forested, and that preserved things. That created, if you like, a kind of no-go zone, because the villages within them were sacrificed for France as part of a wider memorial with the forest at Verdun, and people did not return to live there. The people that did go there were pilgrims to the battlefields, families coming to see where a poilu had fallen, or veterans returning within their own country to see the places where they'd fought and where their comrades had died. Some villages were abandoned and never rebuilt in the same places. And was that because the ground there was so polluted that they couldn't rebuild it, or was it they were, as we've said, so pulverised that it just simply wasn't possible to rebuild places in exactly the same place? When I look at what Courcelette looked like at the end of the Great War, I marvel that that village rose again. And when you go to some of the cities like Arras and you stand there in the middle of the city and you see how it rose like other places on the Western Front, like these phoenixes from the ashes of destruction. It really, it is quite incredible to think of that. It was a modern miracle of the 1920s in many, many ways. But what we see is that by the mid-1920s, when we began to kind of dive deep into this subject, we see that the Zone Rouge, the red zone, had recovered. Houses and farms and factories and villages and towns had been rebuilt. Roads had been repaired. Railways were running again. There's a poem by two British veterans who returned to the battlefields around La Bassée that talks about buses running on the road. They are incredulous when they come back and see that this devastated landscape has recovered. And there's a bus service taking people to work or to the farms. And that's kind of typical of how these places recovered and life went back to normal. So what we see by this period of the mid-1920s is that only a small percentage of what had once been this red zone remained untouched or uncultivated. In that respects, as an entire zone, the red zone, the Zone Rouge, had ceased to exist. It was now patches of red rather than an entire area. That didn't mean that the realities of the war went away. I mean, when we read the stories of veterans who returned in that interwar period, there are many, many accounts of those of how the munitions and the collapse of dugouts opened up holes in the road and munitions killed farmers. Will Bird, Canadian veteran, the Black Watch of Canada, he went back and visited the battlefields in the interwar period, and he spoke about a barn where the gas cylinders had eroded and the gas had come out, and the farmer opened his barn doors one morning and the whole herd of cows had been gassed overnight and been killed. So that kind of legacy was clearly going on. And nothing on that kind of scale has happened now, but there is a legacy of farmers still being injured and in some cases killed. Not quite as many as people believe, but certainly they are injured. Most of the deaths from munitions on former Great War battlefields are collectors who are trying to take this stuff apart, diffuse it to put in their collections or to sell at military affairs, incredible as that may sound. So farmers were killed. Ground remained difficult and dangerous to cultivate. And again, we've got many stories of that. But in the decades after the Second World War, that becomes less and less of a problem. Possibly to do with the change in farming methods, or perhaps the landscape had recovered to a point where that was just less of a problem, nearly half a century as it was then after the war had ended. So what were these areas then that the journalists were talking about in 2014, given that quite clearly that the Zone Rouge had existed, but it existed no more, certainly by the time of a century after the Great War? There were those huge French camps, that's what they were seeing, and the firing range at Douaumont that we'd mentioned, and other places. And there are plenty of stories like Spancourt where there are these dumps of munitions and gas. You don't have to go far, as we've said, to find those. And what we're not trying to do here is trivialise this issue in any way. The legacy of the Great War is a reality for those people who live and work and try to carry out their lives on those former battlefields of the Great War. And it clearly, the stories that emerge like that show that this is still an issue, and that the so-called iron harvest, the harvesting, the turning up of grenades and mortar rounds and shells and everything else from the Great War, remains a massive problem right across the battlefields of the old front line. But the idea that there are these no-go areas, well, they do exist. I mean, these military camps are not open to the public. You can't just wander in there. They're high security around them. And that the dangers that the signs that are on the fences and the gateways around them speak of are not dangers of the Great War. They're not saying if you go in here, you're going to tread on a crapouillet French mortar and get yourself blown apart. It's modern munitions. These are training grounds. So there will be modern rounds that are lying around. And some of modern French armour uses depleted uranium rounds. So there is potential from the effects of those if you wander into these areas, if those rounds have not been recovered. So what we're seeing on the landscape today, when we see these no entry signs and it's forbidden to enter and a skull and crossbones on a panel, we're not seeing a reference to the Great War. We're seeing a reference to the modern use of that ground by a modern military. In many ways, when we look at those actual camps, for example, in particular, like no man's land in the Great War itself, and we spoke about this in the episode on birds on the Western Front, these vast abandoned areas or places forested over, like at Verdun, created, as Christina Holstein said, snapshots of the past, areas frozen in time. But also, if we look at it from a natural world point of view, vast areas of wilding, what we'd now call wilding, places abandoned, and weeds and shrubs and all kinds of plants grow, encouraging wildlife. So if these were areas really truly polluted beyond all possible use by war, how would this be possible? How would these areas of wilding have been left to flourish in the way that they have, and flourish in the way that they have would not be possible at all if this ground was polluted. And probably, if I don't think it's ever been done, if there was a study of the wildlife in these areas, it would probably find a lot of rare species. Perhaps it has been done. Perhaps someone listening to this can point me in that direction. So rather than seeing the surface of Mars in these places, we're actually seeing a place where nature thrives, where wildlife thrives. It's a positive thing. And when you look at how these stories, many of them classified Verdun and the forest at Verdun as part of this, how can a place that was so polluted where nothing could grow, how could it be a forest? How could there be a forest at Verdun if it wasn't possible for anything to grow in that ground? A lot of these articles don't really clearly kind of think about what it is they're saying and then illustrate in those articles with photographs of the forest as it is today, looking like any other natural forests anywhere else in France. In this respect, the average field on the Somme, not the subject of these reports, is just as dangerous, just as polluted, just as problematic as supposedly these areas of the Zone Rouge. But that, of course, didn't make good copy during the centenary, and those kind of stories fell off a cliff. So these were great stories for that centenary when so many people were engaged by the subject of the First World War. But they created a myth in the minds of these people that there were these red zones still existing and that there were these no-go areas where the past was frozen and they were just as dangerous as they had been during the great bombardments of the First World War. But the Zone Rouge is something in the past. It happened. It doesn't still exist. It ended in the 1920s, really. But the echoes of it, the repercussions of aspects of its history, will continue, no doubt, for centuries to come. And within it we find lessons, I think, for a modern world with everything that is happening in Ukraine right now. Areas devastated on a scale of the First World War, saturated with munitions. The people there must wonder what the future holds, just as those who return to the battlefields of the Western Front in that immediate post-war period. So while those battlefields have secrets, and still keep many of them, the Zone Rouge, the red zone, today is a myth, and shows as ever how complex the mix of history, landscape, the past and present is on those criss-cross pathways of the Great War. But what is clear is that even beyond the centenary of that massive conflict, its dark past still casts long shadows across the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/.